I'm really excited to be moderating this panel because I'm a huge fan of graphic novels. I'm not a graphic novelist myself because I think I lack the kind of skills to draw the same person over and over again in different positions. Once I've painted somebody, then I'm sort of done with them, but I don't think I could do, them picking something up and turning around, and I don't imagine myself that way, but Nick says that, that it's possible that I can maybe overcome this. So we have, this is for not just me, but we can all be graphic novelists, he claims, and he has some things on his website. So I will first introduce Nick. This is Nick Sousanis, and he's author of this wonderful book, Unflattening. It's I was told when I was given the assignment to moderate this panel that I could have a copy of Nick's dissertation, and I said, okay. I didn't know what it was or anything, so I said, okay, because I'm a recovering academic, and I really didn't want to read a dissertation. But then this wonderful book came in the mail, and I thought, what is this? I didn't order it. It's a kind of a treatise, a philosophical treatise on how graphic novels break down our sort of frozen perceptions in everyday life, that the combination of images and words together kind of break apart cliches and stereotypes and all different kinds of frozen or ossified aspects of our thinking. And it's got lots of endnotes. It's really is a very scholarly work, but it's a comic, and it's the only dissertation ever in the United States, or maybe the world, done as a graphic novel, and I urge you to run and buy it from your nearest independent bookstore and not from Amazon. And then G. Willow Wilson is, I think, very well known in comics circles. She's also written 2 books that just have words in them. The Butterfly Mosque and Olive the Unseen, and then she's known for a number of different series. Cairo is just one book, right? Yeah. And then the Air series. And then most recently, she's become quite well known because of her amazing Ms. Marvel series about a young Pakistani American superhero in Jersey City, and it's really quite mind-boggling how much that breaks down the stereotypes. So sort of the other side of Nick's theory is your practice, I think. And I just wanted to add one personal anecdote. I got the compilation, the first compilation in the mail, and then I couldn't find it, and my 7-year-old daughter was in her room with her door closed, which is not usual. And I went in and opened the door, and she was on her bed under a parasol that she'd set up. And she said, go away. And I said, why? And she said, nothing, go away. And I went and looked over her shoulder, and she was reading Ms. Marvel, and she was like, and I was so pleased because it's a wonderful comic, obviously, for young adults or adults, but it's even more wonderful for little children to read something like that and to not start out with the all guys all the time superheroes. So she hopefully will never even understand that world thanks to people like Willow. So yes, cheers.
Tell her I said hello.
So I wanted to have each of these accomplished writers, artists, tell you a bit about their work, and with some slides to give us a feel for what their work looks like, in case you haven't seen it and you didn't come here because you're a fanboy or a fangirl, but you're open to suggestions. So I think, Nick, we know your slides are up there, so do you want to go first? And then Willow will follow up. Do we have the, yeah, okay. Well,
did you ever come up?
All right, hit it.
How's everyone doing tonight?
Oh, I guess that's
There we go.
Go ahead.
Do I have control or no? No.
Just go, like, tell them.
I'll just, okay. Got it.
Old school.
No problem. Okay, so yeah, I did what's probably the first doctoral dissertation in comics form. I was in the School of Education. And maybe, slide? This is going to be strange. I'll say I started out as many people probably my age, many boys my age started out reading comics. I'm one of those kids whose first word was Batman. And I made my own superhero through high school. And slide? This is good. I made my own superhero through high school, and he made a reappearance in the dissertation on my chapter on imagination. And I'm sort of introducing this just to say that as much as I loved comics, at the time that I was making comics, it wasn't like the thing you could do as an intellectual. It wasn't taken seriously in the way that we are seeing such a huge transformation now. So I studied mathematics in school, and much later came back to making comics full on. And I think now I teach courses to people who use comics in their classrooms, and I'm really excited about the change we're seeing. We're seeing it, in superhero comics. We're seeing it in all kinds of comics and what they can be. So I just wanted to say a few words about what it is I did, and then we'll move on.
Can we turn this part of the light down because it's blanking out the slide? Somebody just turned the stage light on. Yeah, can you turn this light off? Yeah.
Awesome. So anyway, the book's called Unflattening, and it's trying to push against ideas of flatness, which talk about narrowing of our thought, narrowing of thinking, and I can apply that to what's going on in schools. You can apply it to what's going on in what we accept as scholarship, what we accept as thinking, what's going on around testing. Slide. And I'm really pushing this idea of ways of seeing and bringing in multiple perspectives. So the book is really about how do we look at things from literally multiple perspectives, and then metaphorically, how do we come at things from different ways? And comics are one way that you can do that. You come in from image and text and other things. And so it's really asking this question, what have we been missing when we're only allowing one kind of thinking, and what might we make possible? And I'll maybe just spend 1 second here on my dog page, because I really like it. And I like to talk about my dog in public. He's not with us, but anyway. I was talking about ways of seeing, but I wanted to say by ways of seeing, I mean things beyond just drawing. I mean all kinds of ways of seeing. So I talked about the dog's sense of smell, which you all know is stronger than yours and mine, right? You know this. But what's really true about the dog's sense of smell is that it's more nuanced, which means a dog, I come up and I see a cream or beige colored chair. I see the shape of it. But a dog comes up and knows who sat here an hour ago, and knows who sat here yesterday, and knows maybe about a week back. It has access to layers of time. And it's kind of a way of, you can think about it as a way of seeing that we just don't have, and we have no way to access. So I'm really sort of arguing that let's bring those kinds of things into the classroom, bring those into how we make learning. Slide. And it very specifically tackles comics, and we're going to talk about image and text. And I'll say, so sure, comics do image and text, but I think even more than that, they're two different ways we think. And we think in sort of linear, sequential, moment to moment. We have different sequence of events. But at the same time, you have this all over. Your thoughts are loose from time. They're not going that way. And I think comics, when you're both reading things and you're viewing things like this, they allow your mind to sort of move back and organize thoughts in a very different way than other modes of communication do. So slide. And so for me, I'm much less interested in illustrating text than I am in finding ways to visually embody ideas and let the whole page structure, and we can talk about it a lot, but I won't now. How do I make the ideas move across the page, and how do I make your thoughts, how do I get my thoughts to convey the ideas through the whole structure? So slide. And I won't dwell on this, because I do really question, and I ask this question a lot, is what do your thoughts look like when, do they look like rows of text? I'm going to guess they don't. And I won't say that they look like comics, but I think they do. 2 more slides, I think, and then we'll be done. And so I just say one more thing about process is that this work this does not come out of a written text that then has pictures added to it. It's really the very process of drawing is teaching me where to go. And it's really, I think about it as having a partner that I collaborate with. I make sketches, and the sketches teach me what I need to know, and it keeps going. And one more slide. And I think we can end on this one. But I guess the thing that it's taught me, and the lesson that I see in my students all the time, is that working this way is not just a way to bring ideas to more people and make it accessible, but it's also become a way to change how you think. when you work visually, it's that part of work textually and visually from the start, it really changes where you can go and what you can see, and I feel really fortunate to be able to work that way and to work with, to expand that idea, to work with students, to see them change the very things they can do, even if they describe themselves, as most people on the planet do, as non-drawers. I think we're very visual creatures, and when we learn to sort of remember that, it really can change who we can be. So I'll stop with that. Thank you. So formal.
I mean, I feel like I want to sit here and listen to you give a class now. Because, Nick, we were talking about earlier as we were sitting outside preparing for this panel, is kind of a unicorn in industry terms, because he can both write and draw and letter his own comics. No, but you did. You used the lettering program, and I
failed handwriting.
No, but nobody hand letters anymore. Like, even the letterers, who that's their whole job, they use the computer programs. So, technically, you are also a letterer. For me, comics is really first and foremost a collaborative medium, because what I do when I write a script, which looks a lot like a screenplay, except instead of writing scene 1, I write panel 1, and then I describe whatever's going on in that image. My job comes first, but it is not the only job, nor is it arguably the most important job, except in the fact that if I'm not done on time, then nobody is done on time, because all of the people who work on the book after I do will then also be late. I don't know if Are
we going to have slides for Willow, or did you?
Nick and Daisy actually made my slides.
Nick made it.
This is how committed they are.
Yeah.
I had another event here in Boulder, actually, at CU that I had to do before this one, and so I came woefully unprepared. Oh, look at this.
Look at
awesome.
There's one of her, one of Aaron, and everything is missing.
Okay, all right, awesome. I'm like, this is going to be a grab bag. So after I write my script or my screenplay for a 20-page, usually, story that comes out once a month, that goes off to an artist who then takes those words and turns them into still images. And then that goes off to a colorist who layers on color on top of the black and white inked drawings, usually. Cairo was in black and white. But yeah, you can scroll down, that's fine. This is Air. Oh, that's my favorite panel. So, in a second, I'll tell you a funny story about this panel. And then after the colorist is done with it, it goes off to a letterer who takes the dialogue that I've written into the script and decides where on the page those will go as captions or as word balloons. So to me, what differentiates the comics that I do from the books without pictures, as I call them, that I do, is that it is intensely collaborative, and that for me as a writer, it's less about speaking directly to the audience and more about this very intimate dialogue that I have with the artist and with the colorist. Because they're the only ones who are getting the entire script. What the reader eventually sees is maybe 10% of the words that I've actually written. So they'll see the dialogue that the characters are speaking that goes in those little word balloons, but they won't say that I've also written, these two characters are falling through the sky. They look terrified. The sky is very blue. Below there is the water. We don't know where in the world we are. And I'm really writing as efficiently as I can descriptors that will evoke an artistic response in the artist and in the colorist, rather than something that the reader will eventually see. So that's what makes this process, for me, radically different from any other kind of writing that I do. Air was kind of a funny series because it was one in which M.K. Perker, who is the amazing Turkish artist who worked on both Air and Cairo, which was the black and white slide that you saw before, we played with time and how you see time on the page in a way that neither of us had really done before. So another thing that makes comics cool and different from either reading text or seeing a movie or a film or a TV show is that you can see multiple points of time on the same page and your brain absorbs them at once. So you can have the past, the present, and the future interact with each other in a way that you don't get reading sentence by sentence or watching frame by frame. And we do that in Air a lot. Air is quite speculative. A funny anecdote about this panel is I'm friends with Sherman Alexie, who's a famous young adult writer who's won the National Book Award. He's also kind of my neighbor down the street in Seattle. And we share a Books Without Pictures publisher, Grove Atlantic. And they were flying us both out to a conference one year, and they said, and it's a big independent publisher, but still an independent publisher. They said, okay, Willow, when you get to the airport, find Sherman Alexie and share a cab with him. And I said, wow, okay, all right. And I thought, am I going to recognize Sherman Alexie? I've only just ever seen his publicity photos. You know, people look different than they do in their publicity photos. And so I got on this flight, and I was walking through first class, and this guy looks up and says, oh, are you G. Willow Wilson? And I said, yes. And he was like, oh, I'm Sherman Alexie. And there he was, looking actually exactly like his publicity photo. And he said, I read Air. It's awesome. I can't believe that I'd ever read a comic where two people falling out of an airplane is the least weird thing that happens in the whole series. So this book and this particular panel have had kind of the book didn't sell very well when it came out, but it's had an interesting second life in the back, in kind of the backlist, and some famous fans that I never kind of anticipated.
When I'm just reading that again, I felt like, you know, because these two have a really fraught relationship throughout the series, that this is kind of, one of those things, warning signs when you've just met someone you think is really attractive and then they don't get your literary reference. You know, she's like, what? You know. He's like, oh damn, she hasn't read
the Satanic Verses. Yeah, that was kind of an inverse. The whole series was kind of an inverse Satanic Verses. I wanted two people after what might be a terrorist attack falling out of an airplane, but there's a happy ending. That was kind of crucial. You can see it better.
He says, aren't you glad that, sorry, now I can't see it anymore.
Aren't you glad
this isn't a Salman Rushdie novel? And she says, why?
And then he says, if we sell the next one, but we might not have it on there.
Yeah.
The response to that is because we have a parachute, which is basically, symbolically, the gist of the whole series.
Yeah.
So yes, it's Ms. Marvel from here on out.
Yeah.
So I'll just talk very, very briefly about Ms. Marvel, because I think we all want to get to the discussion bit. So I had been doing this very sort of more artsy, literary, non-superhero stuff for a bunch of years, mostly at DC, but also at Marvel, when about 4 years ago I got a call out of the blue from two Marvel editors, Sana Amanat and Steve Wacker, who said, okay, here's what's up. We want to create a new, young American Muslim superheroine from scratch and put her on her own ongoing monthly series. And I tell people this, I almost said no. Because in the days that I had been doing Cairo and Air and writing other things, including Superman, I could not do anything. I could not write any kind of story, whether it was related to Islam or completely unrelated to Islam, or having nothing to do with any kind of religion, without certain usual suspects on the internet kind of coming out and accusing me of being part of the socialist, homosexual, Muslim attack on American values, and demanding that I be fired from wherever I happened to be working at the time, or they would boycott whatever publisher that was. So having been through all that, I was like, you guys realize what if you'll pardon the expression, shitstorm this is going to be. But they were committed to it, and I thought, man, what a great opportunity. Who am I to turn this down? And so out of that was born Ms. Marvel, aka Kamala Khan, who is a 16-year-old Pakistani-American girl growing up as the child of immigrant parents in Jersey City, who discovers quite accidentally one day that she has latent superpowers that allow her to kind of grow and shrink and change shape She calls it embiggening, after the famous line from The Simpsons. And she kind of has a coming-of-age story in which she has to decide both what she's going to do with those powers, why she's meant to have them, and how that is going to shape who she becomes. So it's very much cast in the mold of Spider-Man and those kind of everyday, everyman superhero stories in which the main character, is not the child of billionaires, is not the heir of an alien legacy, but rather is a very recognizable person who's living a life that we all might recognize. And so we were expecting it to last maybe 5 issues. Typically, by the industry method, books like this do not tend to sell well. I say it's the trifecta of death. By the old math, new characters don't sell well, female characters don't sell well, and minority characters don't sell well. So by all rights, this should have been a complete flop. And instead, in the last 18 months, we've had 3 story collections on the New York Times bestseller list for graphic books. So, a sign that times are changing, that not everything is terrible, and that in some ways we may, however fraught, be making progress. So with that, I'll launch into the other stuff.
Yeah, thank you guys. I wanted to put out a question about, we've sort of touched on this, the difference between text and comics, but I want to go at it from a little bit of a different angle. There's a page in Nick's book where you've gotten very into his whole methodology, and then you suddenly get to this page where there's a whole bunch of words all together. And I sort of thought, what? No, I'm not going to read this. Like I suddenly felt rebellious, but I slogged through it, and of course it was about words being all together with no pictures. And it's about, how, part of what he's dealing with throughout the book is how text without pictures is very linear, that you can't have things happening simultaneously, as you were saying about time and such things as that. But, you have to say everything in a line. One thing is revealed, then the next, then the next, then the next, which is really a very plodding way to do things if you think about it. And comics, you can really play with this a lot. So I happened, right after I talked to Nick last night, I happened to pick up this Murakami novel, After Dark, just, before I went to bed. And the whole first 2 pages were a description slowly zeroing in. It's kind of a nightscape and zeroing in and zeroing in. And suddenly you realize you're at a Denny's, because it's Murakami, there has to be a Denny's or Kentucky Fried Chicken or something. And I wanted to sort of open this up first to Willow, because you've written whole books full of words, and then you've become a writer of comics. Can you talk a little bit about what that switch was like? And then after that, Nick can pick up on kind of the observations he makes in his book.
The differences are really huge, and I feel as though writing books without pictures draws on a very different part of my brain than writing comics does. For the simple reason that when I'm writing a comic, there's a lot more technical stuff that I have to keep in mind. For example, I don't want to crowd the art, and so obviously whatever I want to say in dialogue form has to be distilled down to about haiku length. Next, I have to think about, okay, how much of the action on this page do we have to represent pictorially, and how much will be filled in the mind of the reader? In other words, if you want to show a character lighting a cigarette, is it enough to do it in 2 panels, maybe one where the character is taking out the package of cigarettes and the next one where they're lighting the cigarette? Or do you need a 3rd one in there where they're taking out the individual cigarette or getting out the lighter? How much of that psychologically will the reader fill in? So you kind of have to play armchair psychologist and guess. Otherwise, you could take an infinite number of panels to describe a single action. And some people do that. It's called decompression. But for a superhero story, it tends to kind of drag the story down. There's also the matter of, as we were talking about before, the fact that you can absorb a whole page of images at once. So if you want to have a cliffhanger, you have to make sure it's on a page turn. Otherwise, the suspense will be spoiled as soon as you set it up. So it's a very technical form of writing. It requires a lot more discipline. There's no such thing as going one page over or one page under. You usually have a set number of pages that your story has to be every month. The industry standard is 20, so not 19, not 21. If you're under, you have to find a way to make an extra page. If you're over, you have to cut something. And so in that sense, it's tremendously demanding. And I often think it's kind of a shame that until very, very recently, comics have been considered kind of a throwaway art form, not really art, too popular and pulpy to really be art, because I work a lot harder to write a script for a comic book than I do when I'm writing a novel. And it's really like running free in the streets, like Lady Godiva style, riding along, naked on horseback. Because it's really, there are no limits. If you
Writing a novel.
Writing a novel, yeah. That's how it feels, no, literally.
I'd like to see a comic of that, actually, too.
Yeah, I'm sure it's been done. So it really is very, very different.
Do you want to address this?
Can we bring the slides back? I wouldn't mind. Well, just, if it doesn't work, it doesn't work. Dramatic. Yeah, I think so. Oh. Yeah, he did. Can we go to mine real quick? I didn't realize I wouldn't have.
A clicker.
Yeah. There we go. And then click back about 5. Stop. So this right here, and this, I'll talk text and image. I mean, we said this really briefly. Oh yeah, sorry. Is the idea that, look, I mean, yeah, you are going to read linearly. You're going to do that, but you're also going to see the connections and make them right to left, right to left, bottom to top. You start to have all these other ways of reading. Can we go one more? Sorry, one more, 2, and one last one. Okay, so this was not in the book, but it's this was a piece for the Boston Globe where you not only read regular, so the top is fairly linear, but here the whole idea of the page is things that sort of go against entropy, things that go back uphill. And so the text itself, as it comes around the right side, starts to move right to left, and then moves left to right. So the idea that comics can kind of blow up what reading means, and I think that's a good question we can ask too, is like, what do you guys read first when you read comics? Images, or who reads the text first? Who reads the pictures first? Third answer? Integrated? Or you take in the whole page once and then you zero in?
These are both comic book artists.
Yeah, we've got some ringers in the crowd. So, I mean, I think that's one thing. Comics sort of shifts what reading means. And then can we click like 3 more? Sorry. And one more. So I don't, like I said before, I don't write script first. And I'll say, I think your thing about haiku is so true. I mean, I find when I write text, I say way too much. I have a real hard time keeping it succinct. And I might do that when I'm talking too. But when I'm working in comics, I have no choice but to learn to cut and cut and cut and cut, because it has to work as an image, and it has to, the letters have to, I mean, the word things have to connect to the pictures in a very specific way. So I get, in my work, this question, what do you think of first, words or pictures? And I say yes. And it's always this thing where the words are suggesting what I should do in the pictures, and the pictures are suggesting words I need to find. And that dance back and forth, really, I don't know. I mean, it's a very different way of working. And the one, I did a piece with, I did a piece on climate change for the journal Nature. And they expected that they were going to sort of drop a lot of text on me, and I was going to turn it into something. And probably other people could have done it, and I really struggled. And so it became this much harder conversation where we had to, they would suggest ideas, I would do research and say, this is what I think we should do. And it was a long dance, which I know in the monthly business is not always something you get to do. And they weren't experienced with comics, so it's very different situation.
They tend not to get it.
Yeah, if they're not experienced with, I mean, I think people who see comics assume that they can just here's a stack of text,
Just
now deal with it.
Make it pictures.
Just put pictures on it. And I think, I think writers.
That's an illustrator.
Yeah, I think often people who come from literary fields and say, I want to dip my feet in comics, assume it'll be an easy move.
And then they run away screaming. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think
Anyway.
that's a frequent occurrence.
They want to go back to the Lady Godiva part, right?
Right. Yeah. It's like, I want to be free.
Great, thank you. I want to ask just 2 more questions, one for each of them, and then open it up, because I'm sure you guys have lots of things to ask that I would never think to ask. I'd like to ask you, Willow, about the role of comics in combating stereotypes, because I think your work has always resonated with me, including, well, obviously your novel too also combats stereotypes, but particularly in the Ms. Marvel series, you're like a superhero yourself. You're sort of taking stereotypes head on and smashing them. Like, for example, the very sensitive and hapless fundamentalist brother. I really like that character because, who is more stereotyped than fundamentalist, Muslim men, obviously, in our society? So that just to have an inside look at just an ordinary guy who happens to be very religious. And then obviously the female stereotypes you're taking on the superhero stereotypes. We don't have drawings of our heroine looking super busty, or like her shirt zipped down the middle, or like this is what women have been, Wonder Woman and everything for so long. They're fetish objects. So you're combating so many stereotypes. And what do you find about comics that's particularly effective for doing that?
It's interesting, but I think, again, going back to the combination of words and images, I think that gives a unique opportunity to speak to people on a level that you can't do using one or the other. I think images in a lot of ways go to our permanent memory bank in a way that words don't necessarily go. We tend to be more open and more credulous, I think, in the face of images. Like there's the famous "Ça, ce n'est pas une pipe," this is not a pipe. You can read that sentence and be like, okay, that's not true, but this is a picture of a pipe. What do I do with that? So I think that's sort of a classic example of the way that using images gets to a part of somebody's brain and thinking process that just words doesn't. And so, like with Ms. Marvel, I thought, and Sana Amanat, who is herself a Pakistani-American woman, that one of the most important things was to show an authentic and funny and very real and affectionate vision of family life, in which you have this very non-monolithic American Muslim family in which beliefs are different, in which there are arguments at the dinner table. Not everybody believes the same thing. Not everybody acts in the same way.
And this is true, too. Like, it's not like your little fantasy.
No, we're not making it up. No. It's really just true to life. And that even, and especially with Amir, her older brother, to show that even the guys who have beliefs that might be very rigid and who look like kind of the scary people that the TSA warns you about are most of the time not violent, and who are affectionate and who love their families. And I am not a Salafi. There's a lot of Salafism that I have serious problems with. But I said, what, we have to. This is an important thing to do. And there, I think in comics it was a really unique opportunity to do that and to use some of those very, pulpy metaphors of superherodom and everything blown up to the nth scale and giant robots and mutated sewer alligators, and have within that this very human, very authentic story.
It's wonderful. And I just wanted to add that she does do this in Aleph the Unseen as Willow's novel, and she's actively doing these things in the novel too, but obviously something like a Marvel comic is just reaching many more people. I really love the portrayal of, I think sort of one of the only portrayals that I've read of a woman in hijab, the sort of subjective experiences of a woman wearing hijab and how she experiences that. I don't think you see that at all in literature, but in the comics, I think you can punch that even quicker into the audience's subconscious, so it's wonderful. I wanted to ask one last question before I open it up, and this is for Nick. Because you had talked to me about exercises you give students to try to get them to see how they could create a comic or how they could cut up, things into squares and show progressions. And you have these exercises you give your students, and you have them on your website. And I'd like you to give us like a super mini lesson on how we can all be graphic novelists if we really tried. 2 minutes.
In 2 minutes, wow. You start the timer now.
I don't have a lot.
I mean, and I think any comics maker will give you a very different philosophy on how comics work that reflects their own perspective on what they like about comics and how they express themselves in it. So this will be peculiar to me. So you really want to do this here. It's best.
Squares right there.
Yeah, there's squares.
This slide is more flattering to us.
No. All right, so here's what I want you to do. It's best if you have like a really horrible institutional drop ceiling, but we'll do our best. When you look up at the ceiling and the banners and stuff, and pretend really quick that we're going to put it to music. This is a stretch. You guys weren't ready for it. And so let's say the red banners are sort of like a long note. They're like, da, and then we hit the window and it's like, boom, boom, boom. And then there's got to be a ventilation thing in here, right? Oh, over there on the sides, there's these little shafts there that, so they make a little staccato noise, right? Okay, so that's a way of representing time, the music moving, in space, right? So now go down to your sheet of paper, if you have one. Pretend you do if you don't. And think about how comics work. And comics, we're talking about time and space being mashed up in this very unusual way. And so the thing I would have people do, and it's a funny thing to talk about, is think about, and in the prompt I use, is think about a single day. The shape, think about your day. It can be today, it could be a particular day, it could be your sort of amalgamation of what your normal day is. And try to carve up your single sheet of paper into some sort of grid-esque thing that represents the shape of your experiences that day. And you organize them that way. And then, because it's sort of a blank grid, if that's what you do, I ask people to animate it with some sort of lines, marks, or gestures that represent their activity or emotional place within those spaces. So this is all very abstract to talk about without actually doing it. But I think one of the key things is that we talked about this earlier in terms of writing. When you write, you finish your paragraph and you're done wherever you happen to be done. If the rest of the page is blank, who cares? In comic books, you don't leave blank space. I mean, you might have lots of blank space, but it means something. There's a reason that you've left empty panels in there. So I insist that the people use the entire sheet of paper, and they may do it very minimal. It might be just like a row of panels that drop along and there's all this space. But they make those choices very particularly. And what I find, which is really exciting, is in the 7 minutes that you people are given to draw this, is that almost everyone thinks about, they can all think about space and think about how they would organize ideas very quickly. And then in terms of the sort of the kinds of marks they make, you guys, what does this kind of mark mean? This means something, you can see it in my face, it's happening. When you make a jagged edge, you know that jagged edges are sharp. And when you make an edge like this, we all know that. You don't need to have gone to art school to know that this is something you could lie down against and that this is something that would hurt you. So in doing this, I find people both understand very quickly how to think about the space of telling their stories, even though there's no content in a drawing, in a sort of representational sense, but also how much they know about how to compose pictures with no training because they live in the world. So I don't know. It's best if you actually do it rather than talk about it.
Yeah, once you go home,
come find me. We'll talk.
Yeah, find him at the break and get out your pad of paper and you can go through it. But I think we can all go home and make an attempt. I would like to open it now to the audience to questions that you might have for both of these wonderful authors, artists.
Oh, really? Oh, man.
Yes.
I have to go find it now.
Do you want the microphone? Should we have?
I'm fine.
Okay.
Willow, there was an image you created, and I couldn't help develop on that. You talked about the illustration of somebody taking out a cigarette, and you were questioning whether it should be 3 panels or 1 panel. It made me think of, I'm a health educator. I write health education books for children. And the general question I have for Nick and for you, Bill, the first one is, as a health educator, my goal is to change behavior. I don't want kids to smoke. Like it's, what is more impactful, text or comic? I don't make comics. I will, I write text and I'll put a little picture here or there, like most children's books. But I'm willing to break boundaries. Should I be writing a health education textbook where the final goal is to change behavior? Should I be illustrating it in comics and forget text?
You know, the
Great
funny
question.
thing for your question is that the very first comic book I ever read, I was 9 years old and I was given in health class, and it was an anti-smoking PSA featuring the X-Men. And I tell people it must have worked because I never took up smoking and I became a comic book writer.
There you go.
And you can find it online. Actually, I forget the name of the bad guy, but he's like, it's like Smoke-O or something. But the story is that Storm and the other X-Men sort of intervene when this high school track star starts taking up smoking, and then of course he can't run as well, and they say, you've got to turn your life around, and they get him off of the smoking. So, I think there's something to be said for that. It's a medium that we think of as being sort of geared more toward young adults. It's not necessarily, but I think there's really something to that, for sure.
Yeah, that's good. Hard to top that. I mean, the thing, if we were talking, we look at pictures or we look at images through history. I mean, the oldest things that are made by humans are drawings of picture stories. I mean, that's part of us, and somehow that literacy, I mean, that's been prominent all the way up until the printing press, and then it starts to dip a little bit. So, I mean, I think one, we're visual creatures and we should use it. That doesn't mean we should exclude text, it just means we should use it. And two, I think what's going on in comics, besides the sort of PSA things that are changing now, I think, there's a big movement which I'm quite interested in called graphic medicine, which is health professionals, patients, doctors, advocates, using the comics form to get their stories out, to communicate doctors to patients. And they're using existing comics, things like Fun Home and Epileptic by David B. They're using things that are already out there, but they're also creating things. And there's a whole, they've had a conference the last 4 or 5 years where they come together. There's somebody called the Comics Nurse that organizes a lot of these things. And she makes comics about these stories. And I think even people who have no training in drawing, relating your story through pictures is I don't know, it's profound. I think it's a profound thing, and I think the reverse, creating stories, which doesn't, it's true with pictures, can really reach people, which doesn't mean you can't make lousy comics in the same way that you make lousy text in the same, I think you really want to understand the form you're working in and think about its strengths rather than sort of tacking pictures onto something that's already existent. But I'd say go for it. And there's enough research. I'd be happy to send you resources, but there's so much about how comics are being used in all kinds of fields. Yeah.
Is there an intermediate form between text and visual comics? Like Tony Buzan invented something called a mind map about 25 years ago. And what he teaches people to do is to use concepts and ideas in a graphical way as opposed to a linear text. So it's not quite a comic, and it's not quite a linear text, but it's really integrating the relationship between very complex ideas in a visual way. Just wonder if thoughts you might have on that.
I do if you don't.
Yeah, no, go ahead.
If you
Yeah,
do,
take it. Go for it.
Well, I know, I mean, there's graphic facilitation that's allowed in business meetings, and there's sketchnoting, which a guy named Mike Rohde championed that word, and lots of other people do similar things. I know, I mean, I don't see it as comics, because it's even as we talk about the sort of non-linear nature of comics, they still tend to be things you turn pages and there's a flow to it, even if you're also making tangential discoveries. So sketch notes tend to be sort of an all-over experience. I teach them with my students because I think, I'll just say, I had this amazing experience. I teach mostly non-drawers, and I made them do sketch notes. So basically that's taking notes, like you might use big letters, like, you know, draw a letter. You might, I mean, in very rudimentary drawings. The key is not good drawings, it's drawing ideas. And I had this student who is a big class, and I said, what did you think of doing it? Because I made him do it in another class. Go do a sketch note about, and she said, I hated it. It was awful. And then she said, after class, somebody else asked her what she'd learned in the class, and she said, I remembered every single detail in that class, and I couldn't believe it. So she had this, she was totally resistant, and then because she'd drawn this like map of her thinking and what she'd paid attention to, she had this completely opposite experience, which I really loved. I mean, there's some students who were like, yeah, I'm gonna do this, this will be fun, and I'm into it. But she was totally not into it, and then saw that it worked. And I think, you know, I mean, there's a whole bunch of stuff on doodling and how much, you know, like, I got in trouble for that in school. It's the only time I got in trouble because I would draw in class. And now all the studies show the people who draw in class, that's you know, keep your mind moving. The cartoonist Linda Berry does a whole bunch of work about keep the hand going. And when you keep moving, you're thinking. And I think that's true. I mean, you go out for a run, you understand your thinking. You sit at your computer, you might be kind of stuck. So I think all those approaches are really, I think we're seeing them, the business world is taking them, and hopefully educators are paying attention.
I have nothing to add to that. That's great. These days at Marvel and DC, the big comic book publishers, there's kind of been a shift. It used to be that the big two, DC and Marvel, would send artists a very specific size of paper. It was big, it was like A11, for them to draw by hand, and then they would scan that down to an 8x11, thereby increasing the quality of the image. So they would draw by hand and then scan, and then that would go to the, you know, the colorist who would usually digitally color and stuff like that. These days, more and more artists are using tablets because the pens have gotten so much better. They respond better to pressure and to, you know, different angles in a way that they didn't used to. So we're at a real transition point in terms of how much art is done digitally from the outset versus the old way, which is you draw an A/11 and then you scan it down to 8x11 or A11 paper, which is, I don't know how big. It's like 11 by 15. Right, the paper itself, A11 is like 11 by 15, and then you scan it down to 8x11 images. But certainly if you prefer to work by hand, that's still around and that's still an option. You just, you know, you work by hand bigger than you want the final image to be, and then you scan it and, you know, make the file whatever size it's supposed to be. So that exists.
Yeah. Well, they don't all, I mean, like, Mouse was drawn very intentionally on this very small scale.
Yeah, that's
which
true.
is a rarity in that field.
Yeah, for the literary comics, they may do something totally different.
But so I work all digitally. I mean, I do all my sketching, which is where I spend most of my time on paper, and then I couldn't letter. I really couldn't letter. And it just...
He's got this perfect lettering, and he's like, I really couldn't letter.
Well, that's a computer did. So I thought about scanning my pages, and then, but I lived in a really small New York apartment, so I draw on a tablet here, and I do it all in Photoshop, which is probably not the best to do comics, but it's got so many options. it doesn't, there's things like Manga Studio Pro that's like made to make comics. It's got panels and stuff, but this has so much openness that it doesn't help me very much, and in fact it probably slows me down in some ways, that it feels a lot more like working on paper for me, and being able to control all the parts all at once. So I mean, Photoshop, it's got a bit of a steep learning curve, but once you get past it, you know, you only need to know the things you need to know. You don't have to know how to do everything. I use a one that's here, and I look at the screen. They have nicer ones that have a screen and you can draw on them, but I have not really used that much. And I know, I mean, like the iPad now has this, you know, the pencil there. I've seen people tell me how good it is, and I've tried it, but I've never tried it to do actual work, just to play.
If you're interested in a breakdown of how the different technologies work, there are great forums online where artists will talk in very specific detail about the pros and cons of each different suite of software and each different tool. So, you know, I think if you were to go on Reddit or just do some judicious Googling, you could probably find some very in-depth technical reviews of each of those different things.
Yeah. No.
I'm really interested about like the whole linear progression, but I think some of that might be related to English as a language. And I'm just curious if you've thought about or considered how other languages maybe buck the trend of like this very linear, or what we would consider linear left to right kind of space.
You know, it's interesting that you bring this up because, of course, when you look at original manga in Japanese, it does not go left-right, it goes right-left. So the book starts from what we would think of as the opposite, you know, the back cover, and goes back to front. And I think maybe also, does it go top to down? Or does it go down to top? Or anyway, also the layout on the page is different in terms of how you would go. It's either they go down and then over and then up again or something like that. So language does make a huge difference. And in places like the Middle East, where the comic scene is very new and also very much you know, inspired by Western art, there's a big conversation now about how do we make Arabic comic books, because Arabic, of course, is also right to left, and Arabic books in texts are the same way. They start with what we would think of the back cover and go to what we would think of as the front cover. But because the people who are writing these things grew up reading Western comics, they're used to reading images left to right, but writing right to left. And it's a big issue, not just of how do we visually process this stuff, but culturally, what does this mean? And so, you know, I don't have an answer to that, but these are questions that are being asked right now, for sure.
I just take that for a second. Also, I think in terms of graphic novels, there's probably quite a huge difference because different languages lay out their text in different ways. But in terms of written text, fully written text versus graphic novels, I don't think it's, you know, that something that's all in written language is still going to be linear in the sense that you say one thing at a time, so you can't convey 25 ideas in one space the way that a visual image can do. You still have text can only present you with one thing at a time, so in that sense it's not different, I think.
Yeah.
Any more? Yeah.
I wonder if this shift towards the graphic word is actually representing a deeper shift in how human consciousness is moving from in the West, from a reductionistic linearity, where you actually have to reduce your thoughts to put in sequence, to this more synthetic, global perception of multiple points of information simultaneously. And I think maybe Dr. Schlein would say that this is perhaps a shift from a masculine, reductionistic abstraction to a more feminine, holistic perception. I just wonder if you have reactions.
Are you looking at me? I love how you phrased the beginning of that, especially that word simultaneity, because I think that's a key thing that comics, I mean, they're often called sequential art, but they're really also taking advantage of the fact that you see things all at once. So I think that's really spot on. I've read Schlane's book, and somebody asked me this question in a talk the other day. So I don't know about I don't want to answer the gender thing because I don't feel qualified or have any idea. But I do think you definitely. I mean, I'm very conscious of it, and I think we're for all the advantages of Descartes and sort of splitting mind and body, all the disadvantages have hurt us. And I think the idea to get children moving and to get our hands moving and to remember that thinking isn't all here, but it's all in the ways we're constructed and the ways we move around. I do think, I mean, I don't know if it's a general shift or there's more acceptance of it. I think that's hard to speak to, and that comics happen to do it really well. They happen to bring lots of modes all at the same time. So it's hard to say if it's a general shift or if it's acceptance. I don't know if that speaks to you. Yeah. Right. Yeah. Sorry. To be continued.
One of my favorite things about Kamala as a character is that she is herself a fan of
fantastic.
Comics and,
Yeah.
and the Marvel universe as she experiences it. And so I think as much as Miss Marvel fights comic stereotypes, it's also like a love song to comics and that
Totally.
comic history. And I just wondered how much of that was kind of an intentional choice from the beginning, and when how you approach that. Is it how much is intentionally balanced, or is that just because you have that rich history of being a comics fan?
I'd say it's more the latter. I think when I first set out to write this series, I think both Sana and I were like, we have to tell exactly the kind of story that we want because there was nothing to lose. And so for me to get to play in that sandbox, my first crush was Wolverine, thanks to this anti-smoking PSA, which is funny if you know anything about Wolverine, who smokes like a chimney. So for me, it was my own giddiness that was coming out. And also, I wanted to think about superhero comics in a more granular way. Typically, when these big comic book events are being discussed and sort of sorted out, we're going to end the universe and this cosmic battle is going to happen, nobody's thinking about the hot dog seller on the street corner. And I was like, what would it be like to grow up in this universe where you were living this very day-to-day street-level life, but the people you were seeing in the tabloids wouldn't be Kim Kardashian. They would be, Tony Stark, divorced for the third time, and universe saved again by whoever, and thinking, man, that would really affect your feelings about superherodom, about what you could be when you grew up, and so to me, it was really important to have that, to have a character who was really living in that universe and for whom all of these magical people would be very familiar, images to her. And so it was really my own thinking, what would I do, in her shoes? And oh my God, this is so cool. And they're gonna let me use all these characters that I love. And so that when you see that sort of squee factor, that's definitely me, because it was kind of a dream come true to write that series.
But I think it's also definitely a way that immigrant children have sort of helped themselves engage in the culture they're growing up with as opposed to their home culture. And I think that's a great way of showing her Americanness as counteropposed to her family milieu. And we read about this very similar milieu in Junot Diaz, who is a huge comics fan, and he talks about going, and he's talked in interviews, but also Oscar Wilde goes to, the Passaic Mall in New Jersey and reads the comics, and this is how he engages in being an American. Totally. So I think I love that part of it too, that she's a comics fan and a Pakistani American and she has all of these facets. I think that we've run out of time, and I want to thank JLF for bringing us together and bringing these amazing people.